Hi guys, welcome to our second session on global environmental governance. Today I'm going to talk about cooperation and collective action, barriers to cooperation and collective action, what are the two properties of public goods and the implications for cooperation and collective action, what are impure public goods, what are externalities, and finally, what are technologies of aggregation. In terms of the basic question, cooperation and collective action, my starting assumption is that many problems in international relations require countries to work together. Countries can't solve them on their own. So I kind of use these terms, cooperation and collective action, interchangeably. The notion of cooperation gets at this idea of countries having to make some adjustments from their maybe first best preferred policy to take into account the preferences of other countries. And together they make some adjustments to work together to solve a common problem. Another way to think about collective action is joint efforts to pursue common goals. Again, I use these terms interchangeably, and hopefully that helps us think about sort of these collective efforts of countries to work together to solve problems. In the next part of the conversation, I want to talk about Ken Oy's piece and the barriers to cooperation. And this is a chunky segment and helps us identify why some problems are more difficult to solve than others. And again, these questions from Ken Oy can help us think about this diagnostic checklist of questions that we might ask about different strategic situations to assess whether or not the prospects for cooperation are easy or hard. And so he identifies three barriers, potential barriers to cooperation. The first is the challenge of large numbers of actors. The second is actors that may have short-term time horizons or actors with different time horizons interacting. And the third has to do with payoff structures that are not favorable to cooperation. So let me say a little bit more about each of those. So the first problem is challenges of large numbers, and some problems require large numbers of actors to agree to address the problem. And the basic challenge is what we would imagine in even prosaic social situations. Let's say 20 of us are trying to figure out where to go to dinner, but we all have different preferences about the kinds of foods we like, or people have different dietary restrictions. I'm a vegetarian, somebody else is lactose intolerant, somebody else is a pescatarian, someone else keeps kosher. All of those things might make finding a restaurant that's acceptable to all of us challenging. Now let's take that example and translate that into international politics for a problem like climate change, when you may need all countries in the world to participate and agree, and people have different preferences. The leaders, the countries, they have different preferences about how much value they attach to the environment versus other ends. And so at the end of the day, it can be very difficult to reach common agreement among many actors when they have different preferences. And indeed, even if you can reach an agreement among many actors, given the diversity of preferences, it may be challenging to detect and deter cheating. And so one of the core questions is, can you observe whether or not actors are keeping their commitments in any agreements that they reach? That's a core concern that comes up quite a lot. And in a world of many actors, it may be difficult to keep track of the behavior of all of them. So that's another barrier to effective collective action. This has to do with the large numbers of players. The second issue that Ken Oy identifies is situations where you have actors with different time horizons or actors that are heavily focused on the short run. Or in other words, we think about actors that heavily discount the future, or actors that where the shadow of the future does not loom very large, where they're not thinking about future costs and benefits very much. They're focused squarely on what's happening in the next 1 to 2 to 3 years, or whatever we think of as the short run. And in those instances, when you have actors with very different time horizons, some actors prioritize short run gain and heavily discount the future, and other actors are thinking more about long run issues like the environment, where many of the benefits may accrue to future generations. When you have actors with very different time horizons, it can be difficult to realize a common agreement among them, and it may be very difficult to address issues like the environment, or like some environmental issues like climate change, where the benefits and the costs of action or inaction largely or increasingly fall on future generations, whose preferences may not matter very much to some countries. Very poor countries may be prioritizing economic growth of their citizens now, and not very interested or worried about the prospects for their future generations. Or and that's not always the case for those countries, but the other way we can think about this is that some countries may have preferences that heavily discount the future. We also might think about certain kinds of leaders that heavily discount the future, like members of Congress who have to be elected every 2 years, or other elected leaders who may have to think about what are the benefits to their constituents in the very near term, as opposed to thinking about benefits and costs of actions that will accrue outside their time in office. But this second issue of differences in time horizons can become a barrier to collective action. The third barrier to cooperation that Ken Oy talks about has to do with payoff structures. And this gets at the idea that some strategic situations are not amenable to cooperation, that maybe actors have strong incentives to cheat, or what they call defect on an agreement. And this section draws on simplified examples from game theory to abstract away from more complex reality in which there are more than 2 players interacting, and that actors may not have complete information. In these simplified examples, there are 2 actors interacting. They have 2 strategies available to them, either to cooperate or defect, or cooperate or cheat. And the basic idea animating all of these game metaphors is there an outcome, or more than one outcome, where actors, given their expectations of what other actors are going to do, are there outcomes in which no actor can do better by unilaterally changing their behavior? And if that is true in a particular game, we would say that it is an equilibrium solution. It's known as the Nash equilibrium, based on the ideas developed by the John Nash, famous mathematician. In a supplementary video, I might work through some of the maths on those elementary games to solve them. But for our purposes, what we need to know is that some of these strategic situations are not amenable to cooperation, that there isn't a Nash equilibrium that favors cooperation. Indeed, there may be a Nash equilibrium in which defection is the sort of dominant solution. And some strategic situations are ones in which actors may be highly incentivized to cooperate no matter what the other actor's doing. We call those harmony games. There are other strategic situations where we'd say that no matter what the other player is doing, we want to defect. Those are called deadlock games. There are more exotic situations that we talked about in class, like the prisoner's dilemma, in which actors would be better off cooperating, but they have strong incentives to cheat. And we might think about whether or not there are real-world situations that resemble so-called prisoner's dilemma type situations. There are other games like the stag hunt game where there is a Nash equilibrium of cooperate, where we're both better off cooperating. But there's also a Nash equilibrium in that game where the actors have strong incentives to defect. And basically what determines the outcome in that game is based on whether or not the actors have trust in the other actor. So if the actors are confident that the other actor is going to cooperate in the stag hunt game, they should cooperate. And if they have suspicions or less confidence that the other actor is trustworthy and likely to cooperate, then they shouldn't cooperate. And so we can again think about whether or not there are real world situations that resemble something like the stag hunt. There are a couple of other games that I walk through, like the chicken game, in which the equilibrium solution is one actor defects and the other actor cooperates, and it kind of depends on which actor has a reputation for being reckless or risk-taking or crazy. And so in the chicken game, an actor could drive a bargain where they reap large rewards by carrying out risky sort of behavior that forces the other actor to back down. And we might think about examples in the real world of nuclear arms races or other kinds of efforts where an actor takes risky behavior and that may drive the other actor to back down lest they end up in catastrophic outcomes where both are dramatically worse off. The last game example that I talked about was a sort of coordination game where one actor takes the lead in cooperating and the other actor free rides and defects. And we might think of like vaccine development as an example where both actors are best off when one actor takes the lead and the other reaps the benefits of the other actor's cooperation. All of these examples are meant to be simplifications of a more complex reality, but allows us to look at different strategic situations and say, is there an outcome here in which cooperation is favored? Are there overlapping incentives for the actors in these strategic situations to work together? And if not, then we might have to think about what the appropriate solutions are to address that if we think that cooperation is still desirable, but the incentives are unfavorable to cooperation. I'll say a little bit more about how to address each of these barriers to cooperation in a second, but the last thing I'd say is Oy gives the advice of think horse, not zebra. So this basic idea is when you see actors cooperating, your first impulse should be to think about harmony, that their incentives are fundamentally aligned to cooperate. And if you see actors not cooperating, your first impulse should be to think about deadlock, that their incentives are fundamentally misaligned, that there isn't a cooperative outcome available to them. And then there are more exotic zebra-like situations. If those don't seem to explain what's going on, we can start to think about, are there more exotic situations like prisoner's dilemma, stag hunt, or chicken, or coordination games that might help us understand the strategic situation at hand. Again, in a second, I'll walk through how to resolve each of these barriers, but the three barriers that, again, we talked about were challenges of large numbers, differences in time horizons, and payoff structures unfavorable to cooperation. And hopefully that gives us some additional diagnostic tools to think about why some issues are easier or harder to resolve. So we talked about these three barriers to cooperation: challenges of large numbers, actors with different time horizons, payoff structures that are not amenable to cooperation. So in the first example, we can think about how to reduce the number of players, right? To maybe focus on a core group of actors with more homogeneous preferences with which you can reach an agreement. That's one way. You can focus on the relevant, maybe the actors who are most required to address a problem. And that may be different than the actors that have common preferences, but may be necessary if you think that their participation is required to address the problem. Perhaps you can decompose an issue. So a broader issue like climate change may have actors with more heterogeneous preferences, but if you chop it up into a series of smaller issues, maybe on some issues like forests or shipping or aviation, there are some subset of actors who can agree on a more delimited issue space. That's one way to reduce the number of players and maybe reach agreement if that's a barrier to cooperation in this case. In terms of this issue of time horizons, one of the things that the literature talks about is that most interactions in international relations are not simply one-time interactions where the actors interact with each other and then they never see each other again. Instead, they interact one time and then they interact in lots of different ways in other fora beyond that. And so if you only focus on a one-time interaction, there may be strong incentives for an actor to cheat, but if they cheat in this one-time interaction, they may forego a stream of future benefits that over the long run would be more beneficial to their interests if they were to cooperate. And so if you can make actors aware that this interaction is iterated, that requires them to think about not just the current period of interaction, but think about a more unlimited, unbounded series of interactions thereafter, maybe they can start to reassess what their interests are. That doesn't necessarily reweight how much the future is taken into account in their current calculus necessarily, but it may start to make them aware of what the larger self-interest is at stake is. We could also provide basic information like scientific information about what the stakes are over the long run. Maybe actors are unaware, and so they may not realize what the future costs and benefits of different actions are on their own self-interest. And so making them aware of that through scientific inquiry could start to change their sense of how much the future weighs on their current priorities. You may also have to meet them where they are and see if you can address what their current needs are, given their focus on short-term needs. The last area of payoff structures is a pretty complex one, but basically the idea is, can you increase the rewards from cooperation and decrease the benefits of cheating? Or can you incentivize actors to cooperate, and can you penalize or disincentivize cheating? And in so doing, that may change the nature of the game, right? Change a deadlock situation into at least a stag hunt where perhaps a cooperative outcome is possible if the actors can have trust in each other. And so the ways you can think about rewarding cooperation or punishing cheating is through issue linkage. So maybe in this particular matter, the incentives favoring the actors are such that the cooperative solution is not favorable. But if you link it to some other issue, like an environmental issue is paired with a trade issue, they may have strong incentives to cheat on the environmental agreement, but when linked with the trade issue and the threat of punishment of trade sanctions unless they agree on the environmental issue, that may change their perception of what their net benefits are or their payoffs in that situation. Other things that you can do are to give them side payments, right? Like you try to change their perception of self-interest in that situation. Perhaps if their participation is important, then so other actors may try to provide them some strategic incentives, maybe to overcome some capacity constraints they have about implementing the agreement. Other things actors might do is reduce their own temptation to cheat, and so they might think about strategies that would reduce their own benefits of cheating on agreement. And there's some examples in the OI text about how actors might do that. Many of those are drawn from the security realm. Other things that we might think about if we're worried about other actors cheating on an agreement and the need to build trust and over time is to divvy up the benefits so that we're not potentially stuck with what's called the sucker's payoff, where we cooperate and the other actor cheats. And if we commit to all of the cooperative action up front and then the other actor doesn't reciprocate, we're out all sorts of resources that we've invested in that act of cooperation. But if it's an act of, say, arms control, where you're reducing the number of nuclear weapons that you have in your possession, instead of, if the goal over time is to reduce the nuclear weapons by 50, maybe you don't do 50 in the first year, you do 5 and see if the other action is reciprocated. And this also helps deal with this issue of trying to lengthen the shadow of the future and extend time horizons through iterated reciprocal interactions where an actor cooperates a little bit and see if that action is reciprocated. And in so doing, that can build trust over time and avoid this problem of the sucker's payoff, where one actor has cooperated and the other actor has cheated on an agreement. There are a variety of other ideas that Ken Oy talks about in the text, but hopefully this gives you a sense of how some of these problems can be dealt with. The next dimension I wanted to talk about is public goods. And this gets at another diagnostic lens by which we can assess different problems. And essentially, would addressing this problem produce a pure public good, either globally, regionally, or nationally? And if the answer is yes, then that may have some implications for collective action. And the two properties of pure public goods are non-rivalry and non-excludability. And non-rivalry gets at this notion of, is there scarcity? Are we competing with each other for access to a good? Are there limited quantities of the good in question? And examples of non-rival goods are things like clean air, that my consumption of clean air doesn't detract from your ability to enjoy it. The other property, non-excludability, is this notion of, once a good's provided, can you exclude someone from having access to it, or how difficult is it? And again, clean air is another example. Once clean air has been provided, it's very difficult to exclude another actor from being able to enjoy access to clean air. And there are other examples like national defense. Once a country's been defended, everyone in the country is ostensibly able to benefit from that policy. And the implications of this combination of non-rivalry and non-excludability are such that if you can't exclude actors from getting access to the good, then what that means is, once the good's been provided, it's freely available to all, whether or not they contributed. And so the problem that comes from this is one of free riding, in which actors are able to benefit from access to a good that they didn't contribute to producing. And so the net outcome is, if some people may contribute to collective action and cooperate in producing the public good, and other actors may free ride. And if that happens, there'll probably be insufficient collective action. There'll be collective under provision. We won't get enough of the public good in question. And so the challenge then for pure public goods is how to encourage participation, again, to try to discourage free riding behavior. And so we can think about different ways of doing that. We can think about perhaps penalizing people who don't contribute to that public goods provision. But in international life, that's more challenging than in many domestic systems. In domestic systems, if we're trying to produce pure public goods with benefits for the wider population, we can tax, fine, or put people in jail for failure to contribute to those public goods. In international relations, those punitive measures are more limited. They're not zero, but it's much more challenging. That there isn't the equivalent of an overarching international government to impose those fines or fees. It's a more decentralized system in which an international agreement may authorize countries to impose fines, fees on others for not cooperating. So when we look at pure public goods type situations, we have to ask ourselves, is this problem going to generate pure public goods? And if so, what do we do about that? So an additional idea of what we think about doing about that problem of pure public goods is perhaps creating what are called club goods, or excludable benefits only available to those who contribute. And that's another way of trying to encourage participation. And that assumes, though, some measure of excludability. And I talked about some examples in the trade space where we're trying to potentially encourage countries to reduce their emissions from greenhouse gases. And the way to encourage that has to do with maybe border tax adjustments, so that countries that are members of maybe a carbon club of countries with good standards on greenhouse gas emissions are then eligible for lower tariffs for their products traded internationally for members of the club. That's been some ideas that have been discussed and bandied about in recent years as ways to try to encourage more participation and provision of emissions reductions globally, which is a pure public good. I want to move now to talk a little bit about other categories of goods that might be provided by different strategic situations. And this has us go back to the notion of commons. So some environmental problems don't produce pure public goods, but they have to do more with situations where there are impure public goods produced by addressing the problem. And in this case, we can think about two different kinds of impure public goods. There are situations in which there is rivalry, there is some scarcity, but it's very difficult to exclude actors from having access to the good. And here we can think about those as paradigmatically as commons type issues, right? Like fisheries on the high seas, or often talk about rangelands, in which there are limited numbers of fish in the sea, and if you harvest them beyond their ability to replenish, you can dramatically reduce the population and have it crash. So there is some scarcity there, but it's very difficult to exclude actors from having access to that resource. So that's what's considered an impure public good, where there's rivalry but limited excludability. There's another category of of non-rival goods that have excludability, right? So we can think about meteorological forecasting or pay-per-view to shows on television or subscription to online newspapers. It's essentially cost zero to extend access to an additional user. So there isn't really scarcity. Actors aren't really competing with each other for a fixed quantity of the good. You can make that information digitally available to everybody ostensibly, but there are systems of access where the information could be excluded to people based on their ability to pay. So each of these two different kinds of impure public goods has different implications for cooperation and collective action. In terms of these commons type issues, the problem is a little different than the one of pure public goods. Remember, the problem of pure public goods was free riding and insufficient provision of the public good. Whereas for impure public goods, the problem is a little different. The problem is one of overuse, there's a sort of use it or lose it quality to these commons type issues, because if actors think about, they have strong incentives to use the resource, because if they don't, others will. And they get all the benefit of using the resource, but the burden of environmental degradation is borne by all. And so they have strong incentives to use it, which leads to overuse of the resource. And so the challenge in that setting is, how do you reduce consumption to sustainable levels? On some level, it's an issue of how do you figure out mechanisms of exclusion. And in the global fisheries space, the way they've done it on some level is to turn a global commons into a national commons through things like the exclusive economic zone, so that gave more exclusive control over areas just off the coastline of countries to individual states. And that, on some level, was a means of trying to have some form of excludability. But that still begs the question of, how do you deal with the commons at the national level? And then there are systems of access based on scientific assessments of what how much of the resource you can take out at any one time. And so there are auction systems or permitting ways to try to limit consumption of the resource. But it's based on this fundamental understanding that this was a rival resource that had limited excludability, and so there was a problem of overconsumption. The challenge of the other kind of impure public goods isn't necessarily one of cooperation per se, but the recognition is that if you have non-rival good that has excludability, the people who are excluded suffer some welfare losses. And so you have to kind of come to terms with the inequalities of the people without the ability to pay for access to those, meteorological forecasts or such, may lose, access to the good in question. The benefits of excludability maybe provides an incentive for providers to, produce the good at the start, because then they could reap some reward on their investment by getting paid back by limiting it to only those with the ability to pay. But again, have to be mindful of those welfare losses. Again, when we're assessing different strategic situations, the upshot of this is, can we determine whether or not there are pure public goods that are being provided by addressing this problem, or if not pure public goods, forms of impure public goods. And one way to think about inducing cooperation in these cases ultimately is to try to think about what the actors' incentives are based on these properties of the good in question. I'll say more a bit about other dimensions in a second. The other point I wanted to say is that in addressing a problem, you may produce a variety of goods. You may produce pure public goods as a result of addressing a problem, but you could produce other goods alongside. And actually, producing those other goods alongside it could potentially encourage participation. So, as we said, pure public goods are goods that are non-rival and non-excludable, like clean air. So addressing climate change could essentially clean up the atmosphere and produce a non-rival, non-excludable benefit. But that has problems of collective underprovision and free riding. But what happens if there are, say, private goods produced alongside in addressing climate change? And by private goods, I mean goods that are fully rival and excludable, like a clean vehicle. So the companies that produce those clean vehicles there are a limited quantity of those, and they can sell them to consumers based on their ability to pay. And the net benefit of all of these new clean vehicles on the road is reduced emissions from the transport sector, which is a global public good. But the fact that there are private companies benefiting from that clean vehicle provision may induce them to participate. So the more either countries or companies can get selective benefits that they alone can appropriate, may induce more participation. So can you, in a world in which you're trying to encourage participation in producing these global public goods, incentivize actors because they're also getting selective benefits or private goods alongside? So something to think about. The next topic I wanted to talk about are externalities, and these are either positive or negative impacts that are not fully taken into account in the price of a good that we as consumers pay through market transactions. So we might think of these in terms of negative externalities as the negative social costs, say, of pollution that are not fully priced into, say, a gallon of gas that we pay for at the pump. So we may pay $2.40 for a gallon of gas, but if we were to include all of the negative externalities of air pollution, of congestion from excessive use of cars, that if all of those were priced into a gallon of gas, it might cost $5. But because they aren't priced into the market transaction, we get excessive use, we get overconsumption, more use of those goods in question, and that has negative social costs that are borne by the rest of society that the individual consumer doesn't have to bear, and that may take the form of more hospital stays or all the negative impacts of climate change, for example, that we're seeing now. By the same token, there are also positive externalities that are not fully priced into individual transactions. So if I get vaccinated for a particular disease, that has spillover benefits to society, and so the transaction cost, if it was not subsidized, it might cost me a certain amount to get vaccinated. But the wider public benefit, unless we take that into account, might not be fully priced in to the cost of that vaccine. And so those wider public benefits, unless they're taken into account, might mean that there's not enough of the activity that takes place. And so there are spillover benefits of all sorts of different things, people practicing good personal hygiene, or people riding on public transport, or people getting education about different diseases. There are wider spillover benefits of those activities that, unless they are subsidized or incentivized by the wider public, if they're all borne, if all the costs of the activity are borne by the individual, those wider public benefits are not acknowledged, then we may not get enough of those positive social benefits of the activity in question. So that's why there's often public support to encourage those activities. So the question we have to ask ourselves does addressing this problem involve a large amount of negative externalities, or does it potentially involve production of a lot of positive externalities? To the extent that addressing a particular issue involves generation of a large number of externalities, either positive or negative, the counsel from economists generally is to try to internalize those social costs or social benefits into the price of the good in question. And you can do that in different ways through taxes. Some of those might not be politically available to us, particularly in international systems, but recognizing if the price that consumers pay in their market transactions is different from the wider social cost or the wider social benefit is a first step to thinking about what the appropriate remedies are. The last issue I wanted to talk about is the so-called technology of aggregation. And this idea gets at how do individual efforts aggregate in the production of public goods. And the basic idea, or the most basic way they might aggregate, is simply the sum of all individual efforts, right? So one country reduces a ton of greenhouse gases, another country reduces 2 tons of greenhouse gases, and the net sum would be 3 tons of greenhouse gases are abated. Now, other efforts might not aggregate in the same way. So we might use the idea of the threshold aggregator, that we don't get any public goods unless there's a minimal level of effort. And we might think of examples such as fire suppression or peacekeeping. So if let's say the public good in question was, protection from fires, but we only get any public good unless a minimal investment is first made. So if we hire 5 firemen and women, right, we may not get any capacity to address fires at all. And unless we reach the threshold of like 20 or whatever the number is, and can we determine what that threshold is? But the basic idea is we're only getting the good in question unless we've reached a minimal threshold. There are other examples of, let's say, protection from disease, that the level of public good that we get is only as good as what the weakest member provides. And so if we're trying to protect the world from, say, an outbreak of an infectious disease like Ebola, right, where the sort of safety and security of the network is only as good as the weakest link in the wider network. And so if one country invests nothing in pandemic preparedness, then the whole system is vulnerable. And we might think of that idea of weakest link type goods as being true not only for protection against disease, but maybe airport security. So if we're trying to protect the system of airports from, I don't know, terrorist attack or whatever, but some airports have no security, then that's a sort of vulnerable node that could affect the entire system. So recognizing if this is a weakest link versus some other kind of aggregation system is important. Another kind of example that's used is called best or better shot. And we might think of the first actor that makes a breakthrough on, say, vaccine development produces the public good that's potentially available to all of us, which is a new vaccine against a particular knowledge of a new vaccine that's to protect the world against a new infectious disease. You kind of only need that first breakthrough, and beyond which any additional effort could be thought of as wasted. And so the implications of this are that maybe there should be rationalization of research and development so that once that breakthrough is made, there's no need for additional investment from other groups. Otherwise, you're sort of reinventing the same invention. So vaccine development is an example of a best shot type of aggregator. Maybe invention of a new battery technology might be another example that's closer to the environmental space. This idea of sort of best or better shot may get at the notion that perhaps even if the first investment yields some public good, the next investment may yield diminished benefits for the world, not zero, and that's why there's this distinction between best and better shot. In practicality, it may not always be clear that you want to put all your sort of eggs in one investment basket of relying on one, research and innovation effort to make that breakthrough. So you still may want to have some duplication of effort, but it's an interesting idea to think about. Maybe there should be coordination between groups to make sure you're not wasting effort on trying to do the same breakthrough. And there may be national barriers to sharing innovations that mean that some of those breakthroughs don't readily get shared across borders because of patent rights or political fights between countries. But this notion of best or better shot goods is a useful way of thinking about categorizing different strategic situations in terms of the kinds of goods that are created. So we've talked about sum, we've talked about weakest link, we've talked about threshold, and we've talked about best and better shot. The one refinement of the summation sort of aggregation idea is what would be called weighted sum. And this idea gets at some countries may be better at producing a public good so that a dollar's worth of investment or an hour's worth of effort might go farther in some places than in others. And to the extent that you can identify that, then perhaps if there are global efforts to produce a public good, then are there ways to incentivize the actors who are especially good at it? All of these ideas that we've talked about today in terms of barriers to cooperation and how to overcome them, properties of public goods, and what that means for collective action, properties of impure public goods, challenges of externalities, technology of aggregation. They're all different ways to assess problem structure, to think about what are the barriers to cooperation and how to ensure that a problem is successfully dealt with. So we can go through our diagnostic checklist along with the ideas from last week about upstream, downstream issues, about degradation issues, about capacity issues. We can go through that long checklist and say, what is this a case of? What are these attributes of these different strategic settings, and what does that mean in this particular example of what we ought to do? So hopefully these complex ideas today that we've talked about on collective action and cooperation helps us think productively about how to diagnose new situations, what to do about them. And next week, we'll talk about the role of states in the international system in addressing environmental problems. So see you then.